Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang, and joining me here in the studio today is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back. Thanks a lot.
On May 8th, South Korea's Unification Ministry officially announced that it was working on a plan to send food aid to North Korea.
국제기구가 북한 식량 상황이 매우 심각하다고 발표한 것에 대해서 같은 동포로서 인도적 차원에서 우려를 하고 있습니다.
However, in light of the regime's recent military provocations, opinions remain divided on whether the timing is appropriate for the provision of aid. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with a panel of journalists to discuss the Moon Jae-in government's humanitarian aid plan for Pyongyang and the efficacy of such measures. Now, the Moon Jae-in government is trying to build public consensus over its humanitarian aid plan for North Korea in light of the latest UN report that painted a grim picture of the country's food shortages. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme said on May 3rd that North Korea is now facing its worst food crisis in a decade, requiring a minimum of 1.4 million tons worth of food aid for this year alone. So, Frank, do you agree with the assessment that North Korea is facing a food crisis serious enough to warrant immediate assistance from South Korea?
Yes, I do. I think pointing to that report, we need to recognize that that report was produced by Food and Agricultural Organization and World Food Program officials surveying within North Korea. It's not just information provided by the North Korean government, provided by Pyongyang, provided by their own people on the ground there, but through research done earlier this year, this spring, inside North Korea. And again, this is an independent organization, that's two independent organizations that jointly produced that report to come up with the information regarding the dire shortages of food and malnutrition in North Korea. Also, if you look at the rainfall that they've had, this is the worst drought in 37 years since 1982. They had something like 54 millimeters of rainfall from January through early May this year, and that's the least rainfall they've had since, again, 1982. So, some very kind of, quantitative measurements indicate the food shortage and severe drought in North Korea and the need for some type of food assistance.
How do you rate the possibility that North Korea will be able to come out of the food crisis on its own?
We're looking at right now potentially 40% of the North Korean population facing a food shortage. It's a pretty daunting order for any country, right? But especially North Korea, because it's not like they're making a ton of money. Their GDP is not very high. So I do think that international aid is definitely something that we should be thinking about. And as Frank mentioned, the need is definitely there.
Do you agree, Fabian?
Yeah, the numbers are shocking. Roughly 400,000 children are acutely malnourished. 10 million people in North Korea to some extent depend on international aid, and that's just a normal number. So now we know that maize production, for example, the staple for the average people, is going down by 1/3 this year. And that's quite alarming. I mean, in the first years of Kim Jong-un, there was a kind of an upward trend, and I thought maybe the new reforms were taking effect. For example, now farmer families, they could form a collective, and the overproduction that they had, they could sell on the market. So it was basically like slight, modest capitalist reforms. And I thought that could be an incentive to, have a more efficient food production. But I mean, now we see that how fragile it is and how. It could be sanctions. Most likely, the first reason is like the environmental, like the droughts and the floodings. So I think it's looking really severe. Yeah.
So we have some consensus here. We have a definite consensus that the situation is dire and that we require some sort of outside assistance. But the Moon Jae-in government's plan for food aid is receiving some public backlash, with a recent poll showing that half of all South Korean citizens were against sending aid to the north. A similar rift has emerged among the country's political circles as well.
인도적 차원에서 즉각적으로 지원되는 게 바람직하다 이렇게 생각하고요. 또 그렇게 하는 것이 북을 대화와 협상의 길로 나올 수 있는 그런 유인책도 된다 이렇게 생각합니다.
핵 고도화에만 전념하고 있는데 그런 북한에 대한 엄중한 제재가 필요한 상황에 국제사회가 오판할 수 있는 이런 일들을 하는 것은 그건 해서는 안 되는 일이라고 생각합니다.
What's your response to those who say that any sort of aid to North Korea will only help them further their nuclear and missile program?
You know, I think that that's a genuine concern that's there, but I don't buy it. And, you know, the primary reason is when we're talking about food aid, sure, it can be used to feed the military and things like that. But we have to look at this also just from an ordinary humanitarian perspective. Food donations are not going to somehow turn into nuclear missiles, right? There was an analysis in 38 North, which is a publication over at the Stimson Center now in the United States that, you know, ran the numbers on potentially what North Korea would be able to divert to the military if the United Nations $11.1 million food aid goal was reached. And so basically they found that, you know, of that $11.1 million, which was not ultimately collected, the amount that would be able to be diverted to the North Korean military is about 0.4% of North Korea's annual military budget. So we're talking about really not much of a boost at all to the North Korean military. Furthermore, I just feel like, you know, at the end of the day, whether people are against the aid or not, we have to think about the everyday North Koreans that are suffering and whether or not we really want to take a gamble on other people's lives like that and just not give any food aid because we're worried about some of it going to the military.
You know, the amount of aid that is being provided, we need to recognize this also, isn't really that significant. North Korea requires hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food aid each year to bring up the level of malnutrition to normal levels. The 300 calories a day, that's like 1/7 of what an ordinary person needs to sustain themselves on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, again, we need to recognize that humanitarian aid, in my view, should not be used as a political weapon. And this is something even that the World Food Program visited North Korea as part of the production of this report said. He wanted to separate humanitarian aid from politics.
인도주의와 정치를 분리해야 한다는 WFP의 기본 입장에도 공감합니다.
We have very serious concerns. Obviously, what we don't know is what's in the warehouses and what can be imported in. These are decisions independent of our assessment.
And what's really astonishing about this is that he's a Republican, former Republican governor. His message is to, you know, Republican President Donald Trump to say we need to separate these two issues, humanitarian aid and the political goals of denuclearization. Providing North Korea with food is not going to fund their military and is in fact going to generate trust with North Korea and perhaps move forward the goals of denuclearization and engagement with North Korea.
Now, one of the reasons the public backlash against Moon Jae-in's food aid plan has intensified is the recent missile testings. North Korea conducted 2 separate missile tests in the month of May, the first military provocation of its kind in almost a year and a half since launching an ICBM back in November of 2017.
그 어떤 불의의 사태에도 주동적으로 대처할 수 있도록 만단의 전투동원 태세를 갖추고 있어야 한다고 강조하셨습니다.
Why do you think North Korea forged ahead with its missile testing at a time when food aid was being discussed?
Yeah, I think they view those two things very separately. I think the plot point the whole beginning why they're testing missiles now happened in Hanoi. They were frustrated negotiating with the US side. They basically go back to their previous strategy of, you know, scaremongering the world or like basically upping up their leverage and for future negotiations. And I think they could actually be totally on the wrong way because the door for future negotiations with the US could be closing. I mean, right now Donald Trump is still like keeping a smile, so to speak, even though we know that he was very angry, reacting very angry towards those missile tests. But strictly speaking, they have not broken their moratorium. They didn't test like an intercontinental missile. It was a short-range missile.
Right.
It's bad enough of a signal, but it's not too dramatic.
Okay. Now, despite the missile tests, as you mentioned, you said that Donald Trump is, quote unquote, keeping a smile on his face. The presidential Blue House in South Korea also exercised caution, holding back from calling the firings a provocation or condemning North Korea.
북한도 불만이 있다면 대화의 장에서 그 불만을 명확하게 그렇게 밝히는 것이 바람직하다고 생각합니다. 지금부터 북한에게 적극적으로 이렇게 회담을 제안하고 또 대화로 끌어낼 그런 계획입니다.
US President Donald Trump also played down North Korea's missile tests, saying that in his view, they did not constitute a breach of trust. What are the main reasons for Seoul and Washington's restraint in reacting to these missile tests?
Well, I think they want to play down the scale of the missile tests in order to keep open the door to negotiations with North Korea. Likewise, I think North Korea actually, conducted tests that would get the attention of South Korea and the United States, but not flagrantly violate the agreements and the promise that he'd made to Donald Trump not to conduct nuclear and long-range missile tests. And he's done that. At the same time, he's indicated that moratorium from November 2017, that he would not conduct nuclear and missile tests, is in jeopardy. And he also previously gave the U.S. till the end of the year to come to the negotiating table with a different attitude.
Right.
If that doesn't happen, if the U.S. sticks to its current policy of demanding complete, absolute denuclearization before providing with North Korea any sanctions relief, North Korea is going to scale up those tests likely, and we'll see this type of cycle of animosity between the U.S. and North Korea escalate.
Okay. Let's now continue talking about sanctions. North Korea's state-run economy has faced serious headwinds since 2016, when crushing sanctions were placed on the regime. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is continuing to advocate a maximum pressure campaign against North Korea. Do you think the South Korean government could be violating any UN sanctions by providing food aid to the North?
No, humanitarian aid is exempted out of those, so it doesn't apply to the sanctions. Yeah, but I would say the sanctions does make it harder for the average people. We know that it's, for example, harder to import the gasoline that you need for tractors, machinery, agricultural machinery that would make the food production more efficient. I think all that is it's tougher now. But on the other hand, if you give them, like, let's say, hard currencies, where you could either buy tractors, but you could also put it into the military. So it's really a dilemma. Of course, we know sanctions will hit the average people the most, but maybe it will also bring the regime back to the negotiation table. So it has really those two aspects of doing good and doing bad.
Now, this round is not the first time that the Moon Jae-in government has considered providing food aid to the North. The Moon Jae-in administration had also promised $8 million worth of aid to North Korea back in September of 2017, which ultimately fell through. A ruling party lawmaker recently said that North Korea's military provocations near the end of 2017 could have been avoided altogether had the aid package been delivered. So what's your take on this assessment?
I think that's like gross speculation. There's a lot of what have, should have, could haves when dealing with North Korea. We don't necessarily know for sure that if that aid was given, that North Korea would behave differently. We just know that, maybe some people would be better off and vaccinated and eating better. It could go either way in the future as well. Certainly giving this kind of aid is a good faith effort towards North Korea, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to give up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. So again, this is really a fundamental question of, what do we morally owe North Koreans, right? Not Kim Jong-un, but North Korean people. And this is kind of a greater moral question as well.
Right, okay. So the Moon Jae-in government remains steadfast in its will to continue on with the food aid program, despite the regime's missile provocations. So the question now is, how does it deliver those aid measures and in what form? If we look back at the history of humanitarian aid to North Korea, some were provided directly by the South Korean government, while others were delivered through international aid groups. Do you think it'll be more viable at this point to provide food aid via NGOs as opposed to doing it directly?
It very well could be. There are pros and cons of that. It's certainly much slower to provide it through a liaison organization. If the South Korean government were to just give it, it would be faster. You also lose potentially some transparency when you're distributing it through a secondary organization, just because they are now kind of the ones managing that information. That being said, I mean, the 8 million that the Moon Jae-in government proposed, I mean, that was supposed to be given through UNICEF and the World Food Program. So it seems like that was the path that the South Korean government was considering anyway.
I see the pros. I think NGOs are based there sometimes for a decade or longer. They know what they're doing. They have a lot of experience in that. And I mean, what will happen is when they hand out, for example, the medical supplies and the food, usually it's in the end, it's still the North Koreans who seem to act out. So basically for the population, it's not really recognizable whether it's actually foreign aid or not. So, but yeah, still I think NGOs do a good job. They can move relatively freely in the country, and I think give it to experts and they will do it efficiently.
Okay. Now, if we have a look at what the regional powers are doing or what they're not doing, according to a report by Japanese daily newspaper Asahi Shimbun, North Korea had asked Russia to provide them with hundreds of thousands of flour, corn, and other foodstuff back in late March. And reports have emerged that Russia had indeed sent shipments of flour bound for North Korea. It's widely known that despite some ups and downs, North Korea has long enjoyed close relations with both China and Russia over the years. Could Russia and China also help aid North Korea in terms of food and other needs? And how would that be seen by the U.S.?
Absolutely, I think they could help, and I think that would be viewed perhaps as a little bit of a prick to the United States that it needs to engage North Korea if it wants to fulfill, so-called trust-building measures. But I think, as Kelly mentioned, we need to focus on the humanitarian needs within North Korea and kind of get away from seeking political gains through humanitarian aid. Again, this is something that's being said by the World Food Program itself, by somebody within, Donald Trump's own political camp. So, that's what I would like to see more, although certainly, large sums of aid from China and Russia is going to perhaps make an impact a little bit on the U.S. calculus, the purpose of the aid.
Certainly, China or Russia assisting North Korea is not like an amazing thing to the United States. It's them getting a little bit closer potentially. Right. But I don't think it's really all that controversial. Last year when the UN called for different countries to pitch in basically to that 111 million towards North Korea, Sweden did so, Switzerland did so, France did so, Russia did so. We already know that Russia sent about 2,000 tons of food to North Korea in the last year. So, I mean, these are not the only countries that would have been giving to North Korea, if that's the case.
And we shouldn't just demonize the U.S. here. I don't mean to do that. Back in the 1990s and previously, the U.S. was a major donor to North Korea, giving hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food aid to North Korea. That was ramped down under the Bush administration as North Korea became more sort of a security and nuclear problem for the United States. It's hoped that maybe the U.S. can reverse that policy and again disengage aid from political goals.
Sure. And over in the States, the television network NBC reportedly obtained a memo written by North Korea's ambassador to the United Nations, which allegedly blamed international sanctions on top of natural disasters as the main trigger of North Korea's recent food crisis. However, many experts say that the memo may have been leaked intentionally by North Korea in order to pressure the U.S. into relieving its sanctions on the regime. Do you think it'll be possible to achieve partial emergency lifting of sanctions given the current dire circumstance?
You know, as a journalist, I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but I think it's definitely possible, right? It's obviously up to the will of the United States as well as the UN. There are certain things that are sanctioned that could potentially help. For instance, sanctions on fertilizer, which obviously affects farming, or even sanctions of fuel and things like that that North Korea would need for its farming machinery, as well as the machinery itself. Whether or not that's a good idea, I don't know. But I think it's something that, you know, could be weighed, and then it goes back to the question of whether or not the United States should provide any kind of partial sanctions relief just as a concession as well, which, you know, some experts have been calling for a few months now.
Sure.
On that issue of the items that you mentioned that were subject to sanctions, Agricultural Organization and the World Food Program recommended that sanctions be lifted on seed for North Korea, fertilizer for North Korea, equipment, farming equipment for North Korea, infrastructure in terms of greenhouses for North Korea, tractors for North Korea. And so they, you know, advocate certainly a shift in the sanctions approach, particularly in those areas.
Sure. Let's now shift gears and talk about the political impact of humanitarian aid, although I sense that we do not want to talk about that. South Korea first sent humanitarian aid to North Korea back in 1995 when it provided the North with 150,000 tons of rice. The amount and scale of South Korea's humanitarian aid bound for the North have varied over the years, depending on the political orientation of the administration in power and the degree of North Korea's provocations. Do you believe there is a causal relationship between the amount of food aid sent to the North so far and the state of inter-Korean relations?
Not at all.
Not at all?
Not at all, yeah. No, like, probably we would have to look at, like, I don't have the statistics right now in front of me, but yeah, there are so many cases where actually there was a lot of food aid also by the US to North Korea. Did it help US-North Korea relations? No, like it was also in a state of crisis. Then recently, for example, South Korea and the US, they backed off from humanitarian aid to North Korea. And still, what we've seen in the last year was a huge improvement in inter-Korean and US-North Korea relations. So I think it's totally two separate issues.
Even if there was some kind of trend that an expert could, you know, tease out, we also have to remember that Kim Jong-un has only been in power for a few years. He's very different than the people who ruled North Korea before him. So it's honestly hard to even predict if humanitarian aid would somehow change his attitude towards the United States. You know, the way that Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung reacted may have been a little bit all over the place, but we have already seen that Kim Jong-un has more engagement with the outside world and more interest in that.
Okay. This is the final question. If the Moon Jae-in administration continues to remain steadfast in its will to provide food aid to North Korea, how should it go about doing that? How should it move forward?
I think the Moon Jae-in administration should really think about what the needs of North Korea really are. You know, speak with defectors who have left recently, speak with NGOs, and then potentially explore how the aid, how quickly it will get there, and how effective it will be for, you know, South Korea's own goals, so transparency, things like that, if it's channeled through an NGO or if it's directly given to the North Korean government. So just kind of a step-by-step analysis of what the best way to do it is, and then I would say do it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the administration needs to do a better job of maybe explaining to the Korean people how their motivations for giving the aid and disconnecting those motivations in their rhetoric to the South Korean people from the political goals that they may have, and demonstrate to the South Korean people the need in North Korea for the provision of this aid. I was surprised to hear the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning of the program, suggesting that 50% of the South Korean people were against the provision of aid to North Korea. Clearly then, the South Korean government isn't doing a good enough job in communicating to the South Korean people the humanitarian need for aid to North Korea and disconnecting this from whatever political goals the United States or South Korea may have.
Right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Despite deep divisions over the issue, the Moon Jae-in administration says it will continue to push forward with its aid plan for North Korea. The government has a tall order to fill in building public consensus, reflecting expert opinions, and navigating through political opposition all at the same time. And most important of all, it must find ways to lend a helping hand where help is actually needed through aid measures that are carried out in an open and transparent manner. That's all we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.